Welcome to Bazza's podcast, brought to you by Barry York from the land down under. We discuss popular culture, history and politics. Our motto is, question everything. In episode 5, I'm speaking with Arthur Dent, formerly known as Albert Langer. I met with Arthur on the 25th of October this year, and we talked about the current peace plans for Gaza and Palestine and the importance of a reconstituted United Nations body that could actually implement collective security. Arthur also talks about the importance of the struggle for democracy in the region and around the world, and draws a lesson from America's defeat in Vietnam. Arthur was a very prominent figure in Melbourne on the left as a communist and a Maoist, an outlook to which he still adheres. What are your thoughts on the different peace plan proposals for Gaza?
I think they're looking very positive. The media focus is totally on the so-called Trump plan, but the actual reality that they're ignoring is that Trump himself announced that he'd forced Israel to agree because the whole world's against them, and that's the actual fact. The New York Declaration was endorsed by 142 countries to 10. That's Israel, the US, Paraguay, and a couple of Pacific islands, I think. So that's the actual plan that's actually being developed. It's still not finalised, is that New York Declaration's plan. And an important part of it is what's referred to as GITA, the Gaza International Transition Authority or something like that, which is known as the Blair Plan. And all aspects of it will be controversial, and there'll be all kinds of, variations and so on. But the key aspect that I think is quite well designed is they've solved the problem that I emphasised 2 years ago when I wrote on your blog, Gaza, Send Lawyers, Guns and Money. And the lawyers have done a very good job of totally isolating Israel. And the guns were the major problem, and I proposed that it should be the UK, France and Turkey. And I added Turkey in a comment on that particular article, but then drew attention to the fact that there were already Turkish military exercises preparing for it in the subsequent articles. And I'd recommend people have a look at my article on 21st Century Left and follow the subsequent ones, and then compare them with both the New York Declaration and the Blair one. I was convinced that it requires military intervention back in November, immediately after the October War started, right? And that there would have to be military intervention. It's not just that it's required, but that's going to be the outcome. And it is. There will be an international security force, and they're still trying to work out how to make it look palatable to the Israelis, as just for domestic reasons on the part of both of the American government and the Israeli government, and how to actually have an effective force. And the effective force is the Turks. And the controversy will be Egypt's announced that it might be the leading force, and that would be a very bad development. Like, to me, any of the Arab autocracies would be aiming to interfere in Palestinian politics. And a large part of what the International Stabilization Force is for is to end the civil war between Hamas and Fatah and their associated parties. That really, the quartet was the United Nations, the EU, Russia and the US formed a quartet which held the first free Palestinian elections and then cancelled them because Hamas won. right? And that has been, the two sides that should have been able to avoid the pressure that was then pushed on them, that they were really trying to drive the Palestinians to fight each other, and they did, right? Instead of finding a way to get around the fact that the whole world had decided to cut off support for the Palestinian Authority because the wrong people won the elections, they should have united to form a national government and stayed united, but they ended up fighting each other. And that does require the degree of hostility between the two camps is such that it requires two major things that haven't happened yet. One is Marwan Barghouti was the main author of the prisoners' document that proposed a viable plan for the Palestinian factions to unite. And he would basically win any Palestinian election that was held, although, he's been in prison for decades now, so who knows. But basically the people who support him are the people who want a united Palestinian resistance that isn't led by idiots. So I'm pretty confident that Marwan Barghouti will be released quite soon, and I'm pretty confident that there will be an international stabilisation force. If the Egyptians are involved at all, which they will be, there will be a real problem that they'll be trying to push their views on the Palestinians, and they're a fascist regime that's dependent on the US and on Israel. But I would say that the Turks will have to be there as well, and it's actually France that's writing the UN Security Council resolution, and I don't know how it'll, work out, but I can't see it being practical for Egypt to try to run Gaza. And basically that international security force determines who's effectively got power in Gaza.
And that election was 2005, wasn't it, during the George W. Bush?
It was during the Bush administration, and it was part of the general orientation of that administration towards ending the Arab autocracies, right? And they didn't push hard enough against the Zionists. And, they succeeded in... Iraq is now, in that entire region, it's got the most democratic government, I would say.
Yeah.
It's also had a dramatic improvement in their living standards and quality of life and so on. But it's still pretty backward, and it's not, I think I saw you once referring to it as a vibrant democracy. It's got more problems than that, but it's definitely a lot more vibrant as a democracy than any of the people that Trump is claiming to rebuild Gaza with. So anyway, I believe they've solved the problem of guns, whereas my one only, proposed that it just England, France, and Turkey go ahead, which means it would be dependent on there being a ceasefire, that they wouldn't be actually going to war with Israel until Israel's already backed off, right? So that's now been settled, right? I'm quite convinced that although Israel will continue to try to disrupt things and cause major provocations and so on, they're not going to be able to resume the current war. So that international security force will now go in without having to do the extra steps, which I thought might be necessary, is if you're going to confront the Israeli Navy, you also need to ground the Israeli Air Force, and to do that you need a large Air Force, right? And that would have been steps that, are much harder to take and require taking over the UN Security Council. So what I've been thinking about most of the time since that article 2 years ago is how the world could focus on getting an effective Security Council. And I'd like to move on to discussing that. But just on the other part of the fun of lawyers, guns and money, I believe the Blair-Getter proposal is well designed for extracting money from the Arab autocracies, right? And Trump's basically boasting about that he's got all these rich states to pay for the war. I think there could be an interesting combination with the need for an effective Security Council, that I would imagine that just like the European Union has used Russian assets as collateral for loans to Ukraine, and America has tried to get security for its previous loans to Ukraine, or gifts to Ukraine that are now turning into, they want some sort of security from Ukraine, so they've got arrangements about mineral earths and things that are a bit odd. But definitely the European Union's just announced that they're simply taking the Russian assets as collateral, which means that they can use them to lend money to Ukraine and pay for it out of Russian reparations, right? Okay. And that's, to me, quite plausible that there will have to be Russian reparations when they lose the war. Likewise, Israel's up for reparations. They just quite unilaterally decided to destroy an entire major city and kill tens of thousands of people. And the reparations that are due are enormous, and the international consensus that they're guilty of major war crimes and crimes against humanity is also pretty unanimous now. So they won't pay, but if there was an effective Security Council, it would make them pay.
Yeah, I'm keen to talk about that with you, about the United Nations, the need for reconstitution and reform. But can I just ask, where does Trump's, all the publicity has really been on Trump's 20-point peace plan, where does that fit in with GITA and the New York Declaration?
It's basically a branding operation on top of them, with minor tweaks to make it look much more hostile to the Palestinians and much more friendly to Israel than GITA and both GITA and the New York Declaration were designed to be acceptable, right? But this one's designed to be, to get Palestinians' heads, like Trump's main skill is getting his opponents' heads to explode.
Yes,
right.
You're right there.
And this one's designed to get, Palestinians' heads exploding, right? But there were immediate, press releases from some of the other factions that are allied with Hamas saying, we reject it, we're not having British colonialists taking over Gaza and so on. And Hamas accepted it because they actually, have been briefed by Turkey as to what's actually going on. And the rest of them have now accepted it. So from the rest of the Palestinian movement, there was lots of stuff really worried, really upset and so on, and I can understand it. But I also believe that they simply weren't following what was happening. And it's also partly my personal history that I remember the Christmas bombings of Hanoi. Do you remember that?
Of course.
Right. Well, were you aware during the demonstrations we were having that there would necessarily be an American acceptance of the Vietnamese terms for a peace agreement within a couple of weeks?
Probably not.
Yeah. I'm convinced that hardly anyone was aware of it, right? I mean, when I say hardly anyone, I mean among the demonstrators.
Yeah.
But I actually was, right?
No, yeah.
And because I saw in the papers that Nixon had cut off funds to the South Vietnamese puppet regime, and I drew the conclusion, because the bombing Hanoi at Christmas was clearly intended to arouse world opinion against the US, because he wanted to emphasise that the US won the war and bomb them to force them to agree with the terms that they'd already proposed. And it really, was obvious to the Vietnamese government and the Chinese government, and probably to other governments that have, functioning foreign affairs departments and intelligence agencies that keep track of world events. But although it was in the newspapers that they'd cut off funds from the South Vietnamese puppet regime because it refused to sign its own death warrant, right? although it was there, it was just buried in a small paragraph, completely buried by the bombing of Hanoi, which cost them about a quarter of their strategic air force, and a significant number of additional American prisoners. But we knew that the war was basically coming to an end because the US government changed it from a war to prevent national liberation movements led by communists from succeeding anywhere, etc., which is what it was about, into a war for peace with honour. And peace with honour meant we're going to get every one of our prisoners back.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
And this resulted in several years of people carrying on about, are there some missing prisoners? And, it became a part of the American culture that there was this problem of the missing prisoners. And I think there'll be something similar going on with Israel too, because they've been pretending the war was about the hostages, when they knew right from the start that the war would end with an exchange of captive prisoners in Israel for the prisoners, and some of them were civilian hostages, but the current ones I think could be classified as prisoners of war. But the agreement was clear as to how the war would end long ago, and the actual terms of what Hamas just agreed to are exactly what was proposed earlier that Israel didn't agree to, right? And it does involve that. I think Hamas knew from the start that they wouldn't be governing Gaza after launching the October War. They wanted to get out of the fact that they were pretty bad at governing the place, and they just wanted to be a resistance movement. But whether they knew it at that time or not, they've certainly known it ever since, that the place has been flattened and there's real hostility to them. But they'll remain as part of the Palestinian movement, and they haven't actually agreed to disarm. That's being totally misreported in the press. What they agreed to do was, when there's a Palestinian state, hand over their arms to it. And that'll be a complex process. And I reckon Tony Blair's chief of staff, I forget his name, Jonathan Powell, but he was probably the author of that ghetto proposal, and he's fully aware that the quartet was a disaster, and he's fully aware of the process of disarmament and decommissioning that went on with the Northern Ireland agreement and did work out, yes. Right? That they actually did do it. And DDR is very different from what's being presented in the media, that somebody's got to make Hamas disarm. Well, even Greg Sheridan, who's the most idiotic, he's the foreign editor of the Australian, is reliably wrong about everything. Even he says it's inconceivable that any of the other governments are going to go into to take on fighting Hamas after the Israelis have stopped, which he's unhappy about, right? Yeah. So there'll be a continuing drumbeat of somebody's got to disarm Hamas, but the realities are they've got to integrate the different Palestinian factions into a Palestinian state, and that can only be done by the Palestinians themselves.
I'm wondering about America's strategic sort of interests in the region. It's been a puzzle to me why so many American administrations have continued to support Israel so uncritically and to the extent they have. And I can see the Cold War period, that there was a strategic interest in supporting Israel, but do you think the Trump administration, is it sort of part of the America First isolationist tendency? Or
it's unclear to me, but certainly the reasons historically have been the Zionist operation in the US. And that's also what's, they really have had. I remember at Monash, when we were around the time of the 67 war, when there were public debates about it. And I was talking to somebody about what do you think about this? And how should I know? I'm not even Jewish, right? The discussion at Monash was between people interested in the Middle East, which would be both Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jews. It wasn't something that was of general interest to Monash students in 67. likewise, worldwide, the politics of the Middle East and of Israel there's now much larger Muslim and Arab immigrants in Australia and other countries, but basically it's not a daily concern. So in the US foreign policy establishment, you have a really large number of Zionist Jews who are specialists on the Middle East and are, working at think tanks and so on, and they really are basically Israeli agents. Mm-hmm. So American policy has been run by Israeli agents who are very quite thuggish in their ways of smashing politicians who go against them, get primaried and get large, well-funded campaigns to bring them down. Mm-hmm. So they've all been saluting, but there's been a huge breakthrough on that, right? That there's now a majority of Americans are more sympathetic to Palestine than to Israel. And I would say it's really, like, the American Jewish community is very different from the other diasporas, that it's actually a large section, right? That it's a portion of the American population, might be 6%, I forget what the numbers are. Whereas here it's, the actual Zionist organisations are the Jewish community sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So that the Zionists dominate the Jewish community in America, but they're actually losing their grip now. So you have this amazing phenomena that they're running a campaign to mobilise all the Zionist organisations, because a majority of Jews in New York, or majority of the Jews voting in Democrat primaries in New York, mm-hmm. voted for the pro-Palestinian Muslim socialist, which is fairly traditional. That New York Jews, are not naturally Zionist. It's a community that has many political tendencies, which the Zionists make the most noise. But they make so much noise about anyone who's pro-Palestinian that that is unheard of. That actually it was mainly young voters, and young Jews in particular are breaking from Zionism.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask that. What's the demographic within that development?
Well, definitely, like even Naomi Klein was holding some sort of Seder or something outside one of the Democrat leader, Schumer, I think, house, to protest about his pro-Zionist position. Mm-hmm. And he said, and your children are joining us. Mm-hmm. And that's actually a fact. They are.
Yeah. Okay. Does that mean, do you think, that they will not support the state of Israel, that they want?
No, they'll still be ambiguous about it, right? But like the Zionist line is that anyone Jewish is required to support the state of Israel, and that's all Zionism means. Whereas what Zionism actually means is an apartheid state. Right, and there isn't room for, like, the ultra-Orthodox have still got this very strong position that there cannot be a Zionist state anywhere in the Holy Land, yeah. Right? But any reasonable person would say there can't be an apartheid state anywhere in the world, right? And I think the Palestinian movement hasn't really adapted to the fact that it's a world problem. They talk in terms of from the river to the sea, which was the old Likud slogan. Well, actually, the old Likud slogan was from the Nile to the Euphrates. Mm-hmm. That was roughly the territory that they need to dominate in order to actually fully occupy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, right? But so they've echoed it back. Palestine will be free from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. But the region that's actually relevant, in my view, is from the Caspian Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. That you've got an interconnection between, like, the next spring may well start in Persia, in Iran, and spread to the Arab world. But there's also stuff going on in the Caucasus. And, to me, there needs to be a democratisation of that whole region in order to get rid of an apartheid state in any part of it. But in the meantime, I believe the world... the US is no longer able to avoid the fact that the rest of the world's decided there needs to be a two-state solution now. And it remains to be seen whether they'll do what's necessary. But to me, what's necessary is that international stabilisation force the UN Security Council will just be for stabilising Gaza. But if they wanted a Palestinian state, it needs to be contiguous. That means there needs to be a corridor between Gaza and the West Bank with free movement. And I would say that needs to have an international force occupying it. You know, if it's running through Israeli 1967 borders territory and carrying traffic of Palestinians, the Israelis would do everything they can to block and disrupt it. And when they were agreeing to it in the Oslo agreements, they were setting up humiliating search conditions for Palestinians and so on. It'll need to have crossing points between the north of Israel and south of that road, or two roads, one to Jerusalem, one to Hebron. So logic suggests that there would have to be an international authority operating that road as a neutral party. And I would suggest that Australia should be putting up its hand. And the Israelis should be told, well, it's either Australia and other Western countries, or would you prefer Turkish troops patrolling? And then that road ends at Hebron and Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem was part of the partition plan, right? The partition was between a Jewish state, this was the UN partition plan back in 1947 or whenever,
yes.
Right? A Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international zone in the holy city of Jerusalem, right? So after the war, then the neighbouring Arab states occupied what they could, which included East Jerusalem. The Zionists occupied what they could, which included far more than the mandate that they got, plus West Jerusalem, right? And since then, they've announced that they've annexed the whole of Jerusalem, and it's just part of Israel as far as Israel's concerned. But the rest of the world, apart from Trump's US, doesn't put their embassies in Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They put their embassies in Tel Aviv. Right? So there is still a residual issue, which I haven't seen anywhere. It may just be a thought bubble that I've got, that logic suggests that as well as this corridor, there should be an international force occupying East Jerusalem so that it can become a Palestinian capital protected by international forces. The Palestinians certainly aren't going to be allowed to set up a capital by Israel in a united Jerusalem that Israel's annexed. It's got to actually be taken from them. And I reckon it can be taken from them before the whole apartheid regime gets dismantled, simply as part of the peace process, that, okay, we've all agreed there's got to be a Palestinian state, we've all agreed it has to have its capital in Jerusalem, we've all agreed it's got to be contiguous. So who's going to make that happen? There's actually got to be military forces to make it happen. And likewise, for reparations, there needs to be a naval blockade, and if the naval blockade isn't going to be sunk by the Israeli Air Force, it needs to be able to call up the forces that are provided for in the UN Charter. The only standing military force that the UN Charter provides for is that every country is obliged to set aside Air Force units available and make an agreement with the Security Council to make them available for when the Security Council needs to take emergency action, right? And that was part of the whole idea of collective security, that you need a rapid reaction force, which means air power, and all countries contribute to it, which is essentially conscription, though it's, you sign agreements as to how many forces and so on, and you negotiate, who's going to provide what. That should have been in place from the foundation of the UN on. It's part of the Charter, right? They've never done it because the Cold War, followed very rapidly. It could be done now if there was a mood that said we want collective security. There's no collective security without an armed force.
Yeah. And do you see a role for the left-wing organisations or people to, I always think this would be a really good campaign, that could be publicised. Think of the Vietnam days and how it was possible to mobilise large numbers of people. Do you think something like that can be done on this issue of a proper UN, like a UN that is based on collective security and peace through strength?
I'm confident that it will be, and it'll be part of developing a left, right? Currently we don't have a functioning left. The groups that claim to be the left are what I call the pseudo-left, and I think you call it the same. And the concept of collective security is fundamentally alien to them, while they talk about solidarity. And, solidarity and collective security are very closely connected concepts. And one of the emphasis with collective security is that military solidarity, right? It's not just a matter of being solid. So during the Vietnam period, I would say it was only a small minority of the Western peace movement. And particularly, I'm only familiar with Australia and America, but it was a minority that was openly on the side of victory to the Vietnamese. And, it was quite clear we were taking the position that the Vietnamese will win militarily and the American aggressors need to be defeated militarily. Most of the people attending demonstrations and so on had just a general position, this war's got to stop and we don't support America's aggression and so on. Right? But the existence of that minority was a reflection of the existence of a left, right? That part of a genuine left will have that more advanced position than the rest of it. At present, I don't see that there is any such organised left capable of taking advanced positions, but somebody's got to advocate it for other people to then climb on board and take it further. Back in 1848, the Communist Manifesto said, we communists disdain to conceal our views and aims. Our ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. And it went on to say that, one of the first tasks of the working class, I can't remember the phrase, but it was to win the battle for democracy, the battle of democracy. And that battle of democracy involves two aspects: a battle for democracy, which most of the world hasn't, reached the level of full bourgeois democracy yet, and the battle within bourgeois democracy is for the working class to become the ruling class. And both of those are really alien to what people who call themselves leftists these days just don't have those concepts.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking of things like the Ukrainian solidarity movement, say, that would be an opportunity to put forward the idea, well, the United Nations needs reform, like the Security Council can't keep on blocking good motions that are passed by the General Assembly.
Yes, well, I'm glad. Let's switch to Ukraine, because I sort of was paying really close attention to Ukraine right up until the Gaza war, which more or less coincided with the spring offensive ending without success and things being fairly stagnant in what was happening in Ukraine. But I totally agree that Ukraine's central and should be closely linked with this. That the phrase "the free world" got adopted by the US in the Cold War as meaning US allies opposed to what was initially a socialist camp, and then there were several different Cold Wars, but the free world's now mentally associated in people's minds with that US Cold War position, or one of the US Cold War positions. But it actually originated during World War II, when the free world was led by the Soviet Union. And Uncle Joe was the principal leader of the forces fighting fascism. And I would say that today Zelensky and Ukraine are the free world and the leader of the free world. And it's only starting to emerge in Europe. I just saw a very recent conference where for the first time they listed Zelensky first and then the various other European leaders at that meeting. And it was a reasonably accurate list of the leaders of the Europeans defending from Tsarist fascism. except that it still omits Turkey, because Turkey's technically neutral, and I think Turkey's one of the main forces defending Europe. But it's not sort of understood that way. But to me, a major reason why the Australian government and other governments in our region should be very keen to participate in going further than stabilising Gaza, in making sure there is an end to the Israeli program for expelling the Palestinians from Palestine, is precisely because of its impact on the Ukraine war and the future war with Russia and China. And that's fairly complicated to get across, and I just don't know whether it's practical to explain it. So I'd appreciate it if we went into that in some detail.
Do you want to say any more about the UN, like
yes,
the reconstitution?
Well, to me, it requires reconstituting the UN. But the main thing that is required for doing that is a group of states that are willing to take the responsibility, right? That there's a reason why the 5 permanent members of the UN were established with veto powers as central to the UN Charter, right? They were the 5 powers that convened it. France had been occupied during it, but nevertheless the other 4 were the Soviet Union, leader of the free world, the UK, which fought heroically, had its empire taken over by the US, which supplied the arms, right? And the 4th was China, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek nominally, who was also appointed by the Chinese Communist Party as nominal commander of the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, which were actually the Red Army. And the Chinese, declared war on Japan before early in the 30s, when Japan was first in, and eventually forced Chiang Kai-shek into joining the war. Right? He preferred to fight them. But anyway, China at that time was seen as an American, ally.
Yes.
But the Chinese had other ideas, and so they were kept out of the UN until 1970s, I think. It was, yeah. And that's a very interesting. I'm drifting, but a key aspect to remember is the concept of the convening power. When Chiang Kai-shek, the power to decide who is a delegate to the United Nations is actually held by the majority of delegates to the United Nations. It's not held by the Security Council. So, for example, Chiang Kai-shek's regime in Taiwan insisted that it was still government of China. It had just been forced to move to Taiwan because China was occupied by Russians, was their initial claim. Was the Americans were saying it's not even a Chinese regime, that's why we don't recognise it, it's just Russian. But America held that position too, and most of the Western countries went along with it, right? But at a certain point, it became clear that they couldn't even get the Security Council to agree that the Chiang Kai-shek's representatives were the Chinese representatives. So the Americans said, well, this is a really important question, it should go to the General Assembly. So for another couple of years, you had the General Assembly deciding that, yes, it's an important question, so it needs a 2/3 majority, right? And then they decided, no, it's not a 2/3, it's not an important question, it's just fucking bloody obvious. And it doesn't need a 2/3 majority, and we're all supporting it. So they got about a 3/4 majority. And Chiang Kai-shek's representatives were expelled, and the Chinese representatives, took their seat. Now, the same happened to South Africa. It wasn't a Security Council member, but Chiang Kai-shek's representatives were a permanent member of the Security Council, and Chiang Kai-shek was the first signatory on the UN Charter. So it's clearly established that the General Assembly can decide we've had enough of you, right? But it's not that clear, because in fact it was ludicrous that Chiang Kai-shek's regime just obviously didn't govern China, whereas the current 5 Security Council members, there's no competing regime that you could plausibly replace them with, right? But nevertheless, it's the same power. It's the convening power. If you decide we don't recognise you as a delegate, you're not going to be able to get in and vote. And once you're not able to get in and vote, you can't prevent the other ones deciding to formally expel you.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? And once you've been formally expelled, you can't block changes to the Charter. Right? So there is a path, and it should be expressed much more diplomatically than that. But, for example, a very neutral country could propose it's time for UN independence. We want to simply amend the 2 articles in the Charter that say in order to change the Charter you need 2/3 of the countries voting for the change, including all 5 permanent members, and we simply want to delete all 5 permanent members. That all you should need, like any other international organisation, is a qualified majority of countries who are signatory to the agreement agreeing to change it. 2/3, right? And I would say there's 2/3 now who would very rapidly agree that yes, the UN should be independent. It should be up to us as a collective body to decide what's in the Charter, right? It's not a very radical thing. I would express it as being like the Abbé, I forget his name, in the French Revolution. There was a famous phrase about what is the third estate, meaning the commoners. Nothing. What should it be? Everything. But, what are we asking for? We want to be something, right? We want to be something. So at present, all the UN members except the 5 count for nothing in changing the Charter. It's a very moderate, reasonable demand. I think the Abbé, whatever his name was, ended up a counter-revolutionary, but he put forward that initial demand. The third estate wants to be something, right? And I think that will go through. And once it's through, there's no longer a problem about amending it. They would need to agree on exactly what changes are to be made, and the 5 powers would make their best efforts to delay that and so on, but if it was done properly, you could simply agree that we'll have the absolute minimum change. Simply the permanent members would become non-rotating members, that they're eligible to be re-elected each time there's an election, and if they get their 2/3 majority, they'll be elected, and if they don't, they won't, like any other member. And apart from that, we've just got freedom to change the Charter. You could also include a change so that you can vary the size of the Security Council, because there's all these people wanting different arrangements. But keeping the change absolutely simple, not attempting to do more than simply eliminate the veto, to me would be a major victory, because it could happen relatively quickly, and their major effort would be to disrupt that by getting people to argue about who should be on it and so on.
Could the Security Council Permanent 5 veto any such vote, though, if 2/3?
Yes, under the current Charter, it's not just that they can veto it, unless they've been expelled or they've voluntarily withdrawn, right? They have to ratify the amendment to the Charter. 2/3, it's not a vote, it's 2/3 of the membership have to ratify the change in the Charter, which means taking it back to your own constitutional processes. In Australia, that would just be a government decision, but in some countries it would be a referendum or whatever. Yeah. But in the US, it would require a 2/3 majority of the Senate, right? And they would, the two-party system there probably means the US couldn't ratify it. Whichever party supported doing so, the other one would oppose it, and you wouldn't get a US ratification. So it's generally considered to be impossible to do. Obviously, Russia would never accept it under any circumstances. So I'm saying the simple solution is to not focus on the US or on Russia or on China, and simply say we're just creating independence. That all 5 are to give up their power to block changes to the Charter. And that's all we're doing, right? And yes, it does mean that if we want to, we can abolish the veto, right? But we haven't even abolished the veto. We've just said we're something, right? So that's the strategy I would put forward. And I believe if if it wasn't me putting it forward, if there was a group of countries that were determined to establish a collective security organisation, they could do it. And I believe there now is, that what's called the multinational force for Ukraine hasn't really got the capability to act at the moment, but they do believe that they need it. They need to unite to prevent, to end the war in Ukraine. And what worries me is that their current plans seem to be oriented around the US Trump proposal of a ceasefire in place, that they're really pushing for that, which simply means that there'll be a bigger war breaking out later.
Yep.
Now, here's the connection with Israel. It's safe to assume that the right time for China to blockade Taiwan would be when that war breaks out again later, right? That they're busy distracted with the war in Europe and China blockading Taiwan. People who imagine that the US might do something about that now would have difficulty imagining them doing, the US paying much attention to it then. I can't imagine the US doing much about it now either, right? But Israel also would take that as now's our chance to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank, right? The world's busy with the war in the Pacific and a war in Europe, and we've got an agenda, and it's basically a national project to expel the Palestinians from Palestine. And if they haven't been stopped decisively beforehand, that's when they'll have another attempt. So I would say that the Japan, South Korea and Australia should be very keen to make sure that doesn't happen, more aware of it than the Europeans are. If the Europeans are determined to have a frozen conflict, they're also aware that there'll be a war in a few years later, and they're saying we'll be prepared for it by then, right? Whereas unless Russia is actually defeated decisively, China will feel, yes, we've got nothing much to lose, we'll have a go at Taiwan and it'll likely succeed. There'll be a lot of trade disruption and so on, but it's really important that we demonstrate that we're the leading world power now. So to me, if you don't want a war with Chinese fascism, you desperately want Russian fascism to be dismantled. And that doesn't seem to be the European aim at the moment. But I'm pretty sure that they do want us not be having a major war with Russia in a few years' time and having a couple of million more refugees headed their way. I don't know whether they've thought about it much, but because they probably wouldn't want to think about it, because they're responsible for the far-right resurgence in Europe, was that they allowed the Assad regime to drive millions of refugees out of Syria, right? That the Assad regime was just bombing its own population and forcing them into Turkey, and Turkey passed them on to Europe and gets paid by Europe to house them in Turkey, and they're now returning to Syria. But that was 10 years of misery that was caused by the fact that the Europeans weren't prepared to block Russia and Hezbollah from propping up Assad in Syria.
Yep.
Now, all this stuff is too complicated to get across easily. So I'm not confident that there'll be any, grasp of it in the near future, but there needs to be the opportunity to get together and, clarify these ideas and have people writing articles about different aspects of them, which I think needs to start now.
Are there any commentators that you know of who are saying similar things to?
Well, definitely people started saying there needs to be military intervention around the same time I did. There's a group called Dawn, Democracy in the Arab World Now. I just noticed them a couple of days ago that they came out in 2024 saying there's got to be military intervention. And of course the Palestinians have been saying there's got to be military intervention.
With the UN independence?
Oh, and on UN independence, Zelensky turned up at the Security Council and said if you can't fucking get rid of... If you're going to allow Russia to have a veto, you may as well just disband. And they didn't disband, and they didn't stop Russia having a veto. But I think the Ukrainians are quite clear that they want it. But I also think that if the other European major powers, and they really are all on board now with that they've got to defend Ukraine. Like the debate was about whether to let Ukraine join NATO. NATO's now joined Ukraine. The US may get left behind, but it's quite clear that NATO is now oriented around leadership by Ukraine of what to do. And I would say that they have an interest in having a functioning collective security mechanism and being able to say, yes, like for example, the EU can't even easily get around the fact that Hungary and is offside on Ukraine issues and on Palestine issues, right? So they need unanimity for an EU decision, and likewise NATO needs unanimity, and that depends on the US and so on. Whereas they're functioning as a coalition of the willing because they haven't got unanimity, right? But they'd function far more effectively if they were a coalition of the willing that had majority support on the UN Security Council.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Right? And then it would actually be legal to confiscate Russian assets. They're sort of making up strange theories about why it's not illegal, and Belgium is saying, but it is illegal. And they're right? But, the Security Council was set up to provide the sovereign power that prevents wars.
With thanks to Arthur Dent, music by the late, great, much-missed friend Peter Gelling, whose music can be heard on Spotify.